Boker Tov, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. Thanks for joining us this morning for our Shabbat davening. Today is a special Shabbat on the Jewish calendar. This week is referred to as Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of Song. And the reason it's called Shabbat Shirah, the Shabbat of Song, is because it's in this week's Parsha, and I'll read it in a little while, when the Israelites finally make their way through the Red Sea. It splits. They walk through on dry land. And afterwards, when they emerge, when they have been fully liberated as slaves, when the past is behind them, the way that they praise God is through song. And so we're told that we should have a whole Shabbat dedicated to song, not just that we read this part of the Torah where we chant their song, but that we also think about how we can use song as a part of our religious experience, as a way of getting deeper into ourselves, as a way of connecting to God, and even in this world when we're apart from each other, in the ways that we can connect to other people. One of the things that I've found that I miss the most about communal gathering is not singing together. There's a power that we have when we bring our voices together, when we feel the energy of other people singing with us. And my hope is that this morning, wherever we are, wherever we're singing, that we somehow are able to feel the energy of other people singing with us. We'll begin this morning on page 101 with Matovu. Matovu, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael. Matovu, Ohalecha Yaakov, Mishkenotecha Yisrael. I'll turn to page 103 for Birkot HaShachar. I'll invite you to rise if you're able to. 103. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher natan l'sechvi v'na l'havchin, ben yom uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani b'tzamo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani bat chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, mabish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, zokef kefufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, rokaret al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamechin mitzadek aver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shasa li kol tzorki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael bigvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oter Yisrael betifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten li'ayef koach. You can be seated. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hamavir she'ena menaot mena me'afapai, v'hiratam me'afanecha. Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. Utneinu hayom uv'chol yom lecheinu chesed u'rachamim be'einecha u'v'einei chol ro'einu v'tigmalenu chasadim tovim. Baruch atah Adonai gomel chasadim tovim le'amo Yisrael. We'll turn to 112 for the Psalm for Shabbat. Hayom yom Shabbat kodesh, shebo hayu haleviim omrim b'veit hamikdash. Mizmor shir liyom ha-Shabbat, tov lahodot l'Adonai ulzamer l'shimcha l'yon, להגיד בבוקר חסדיך ואמונתך כי שימחתני על נבלך במעשה ידיך מה גדול ממנו. Tzadik Tamar Yifrach Ke'erez Balevanon Yizkar Shatulim Beveit Adonai Bechatzrot Eloheinu Yafrichu Od Yanuvun Beseva Deshenim Verananim Yehiyu Lehagid Ki Ashar Adonai Tzuri Velo Avlatabo. Page 120. 120. Mizmor Shir Chanukat Habayit LeDavid Arum Chadonai Kidili Tani Velosi Machtoy Vali Adonai. Hafakta Mispari Lamacholi Pitakta Saki Vitaz Reini Simcha Lamanya Zamercha Chavod Velo Yidom Adonai Elohai Leolam Odeka. We'll turn to page 122. We'll rise for Baruch She'amar. Baruch She'amar V'haya Ha'olam Baruch Baruch Chosev Reshit Baruch Shemo Baruch Omer Ve'oseh Baruch Baruch Gozer U'Mekayem Baruch Shemo Baruch Merachem Al Haaretz Baruch Baruch Merachem Al Abirio Baruch Shemo Baruch Meshalem Sachar Tov Lireyav Baruch Baruch Chaila'ad V'Kayam La'Netzach Baruch Shemo Baruch Poda U'Matzia Baruch Baruch Shemo Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech Haolam Baruch Yachid Chai Haolamim Melech Meshubach U'Mfoar Adei Ad Shemo Agado Baruch Atah Adonai Melech Mula Batishbachot. You can be seated. 123. Hodu Ladonai Kiru Vishmo Hodu V'Amim Alilotav Shirilo Zamrilo Sichu B'Chon Shem Shalav Hashem Kashmai Sachlem Dir Shem Nemed Hashem. Ki gadol Adonai Mahulal Me'od V'norahu al kol Elohim Ki kol Elohei Amim Elilim V'Adonai Shamayim Asa. Second paragraph on 124. Hod v'hadar lefanav oz v'chedva bimkamo havu l'Adonai mishpachot amim havu l'Adonai kavod va'oz havu l'Adonai kavod shemosim milchavim shach v'Adonai b'hadar kodesh chilu milfanav klar tafti kontivei abatim adiyas mochmei v'neh. Elohei Yisrael min olam adon leveimru kol amamein v'halel Adonai Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lahadam raglav kadoshu Ramemu Adonai Eloheinu v'hishtachavu lahar kodsho ki kadosh Adonai Eloheinu ve'hu rachum yechaper avon ve'lo yashchit v'hir bala shiva po ve'lo yair kol chamato atah Adonai lo tichla rachamecha mimeni chasam. Adonai Tzevaot, Ashrei Adam Boteach Bach, Adonai Hoshia, Melech Yaneinu, Ve'yom Koreinu, Hoshia et Amecha, Uvarech et Nachalatecha, Ureim v'naseim Adonai Shenu Chiktam. Va'ani b'chastecha v'tachti, Ageli b'bishuatecha, Ashir el Adonai, King Amalai. We'll turn to page 130, the very last line in the Hebrew and in the English side in the transliteration. Orech yamim aspiehu ve'arehu vishuati. I shall satisfy you with the fullness of days and show you my deliverance. Orech yamim aspiehu ve'arehu vishuati. 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 We'll continue on the top of 136 with Ashrei. Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Od Yehalelucha Selah. Od Yehalelucha Selah. Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha Od Yehalelucha Selah. Od Yehalelucha Selah. Ashrei Shekachalo, Ashrei Shrelam Tilam Lenavin Haramim Chaylohim Melech Veverchashumalim Learn the Narish Bach Masecha Gvrotecha Yagidu Adarka Vododecha Vidarin Votecha Secha Bezuz Nortecha Yomeru Udulatcha Asaprana Zecharav Dupayamim. Tehilat Adonai Yedaber Pi Vivarek Basar Shem Kodsho Leolam Va'ed Va'anachnu Nevarech Ya Me'ata Ve'ad Olam. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Page 141. Hallelujah. 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 El Bekodsho. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Birki Auzo. Hallelujah. 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 Vigvorotav. Hallelujah. Hallelujah. Care of good love. Hallelujah. hallelujah, 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 betake a shofar, hallelujah, hallelujah, benevel vechinor. Hallelujah, 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 b'tov u'machol, hallelujah, hallelujah, b'minim ve'ugav, hallelujah, 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 v'tziot alei shama, hallelujah, hallelujah, v'tziot alei teruah, kol haneshama tehallel, hallelujah, hallelujah, kol haneshama tehallel, hallelujah, kol haneshama tehallel, hallelujah. Baruch Adonai le'olam, amen ve'amen. Baruch Adonai mitzion, shochin Yerushalayim, hallelujah. Baruch Adonai le'olam, u'baruch Shem kavodo le'olam, ve'yimalech vodo kol haaretz, amen ve'amen. We'll rise, page 142. Vayevarech David et Adonai le'nei kol kahal, vayomer David, Baruch atah Adonai Elohei Yisrael Avinu me'olam va'ad olam. L'chadonai hagdula v'hagvura v'tiferet v'hanetzach v'hod ki chol b'shamayim v'aretz. L'chadonai mamlecha v'amin aseh l'chol l'rosh v'shalom. Atahu Adonai Elohim asher bacharta be'Avram v'hotzeto me'or kasdim v'samta shemo Avraham u'matata et levavo ne'eman lefanecha v'charoti mo habrit לתת את ארץ הכנעני, החיתי האמורי והפריזי והיבוסי והגרגשי, לתת לזרוע, ותקם בדברך כי צדיקת ותרנים. והים בקעת לפניהם, ויעברו בתוך הים ביבשה, ואת רודפיהם ישלח תווים צולות, כמו אבן במים עזים, ויושע אדוני ביום ההוא את ישראל ממצרים, וירא ישראל מצרים את שפתיהם, וירא ישראל את האל הגדולה, אשר עשה אדוני במצרים, ויראו את אדוני, ויאמינו באדוני ובמשה עבדו, אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השיר הזאת לאדוני, ואמרו לאמור, אשר אדוני כי גאוגה סוס ורחבו רמה בים, עוזי וזמרתיה, ויהי לישועה, עוזי וזמרתיה, ויהי לישועה, עוזי וזמרתיה, ויהי לישועה, עוזי וזמרתיה, ויהי לישועה. זה לוויין ויהיו אל האביב רממנו אדוני. Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, v'tikach Miriam הנביאה, אחות אהרון את התוף בידה, ותצאנה כל הנשים אחריה בתופים ובמחולות, ותן להם מרים Shir l'Adonai ki ga'o ga'a, sus v'rach v'ramavayam. I want to share a brief piece of Torah about these 3 lines that I just chanted because it comes from this week's Parsha. It's actually a commentary that's in our Siddur on the left-hand side from Rashi. The question is, these 3 lines are saying that Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, she took her timbrel in her hand and she went out, and all of the women followed her with timbrels and dancing, and she led them in song. And the question is, they had just come out from Egypt, taking really what they needed, right? There wasn't even time for the bread to rise, and yet she has a timbrel. And the question is, why would she have a timbrel? How would she have it? And Rashi says, the righteous women of that generation had faith that the Blessed Holy One would perform miracles for them. So they brought timbrels with them from Egypt, from Mitzrayim, to be able to sing and dance at such a moment. Rashi is drawing on a midrash that talks about the confidence that these women had that a miracle would happen, and so they lived their lives in a way that they would be prepared to celebrate. And for me, it's a beautiful commentary for all time, but especially for us right now, of what can it mean for us to live our lives with the type of confidence that they had, that we make our way through even really difficult times, right? They're coming out of slavery, and yet they have such belief that something good is going to happen, something that will be worthwhile for their celebrations, that they prepare in advance for that to happen. Bottom of 144. Ki l'Adonai melucha moshel bagoyim, v'alu moshim b'hartzion lishpot et haresav, v'hayeta l'Adonai hamelucha, v'haya Adonai l'melech al kol haaretz, b'yom ha'u Adonai echad, u'shemo echad. You can be seated. We're at the top of 145 with Nishmat Kol Chai. Nishmat Kol Chai, tevarech et shimcha Adonai Eloheinu, v'rach kol basar, tefer titrem zichrocha malkeinu tamid. Mi yidmelach umi shvelach umi yaroch lach ha'el hagadol hagibor v'hanora el elyon koneh shamayim va'aretz nehalel chaun shabechecha unfeircha nvorech et shem kodshecha ka'amor leDavid barchi nafshi et Adonai v'chol keravai et shem kodsho hayel b'tatu motu zecha Hagadol b'chavod shemecha, hagibor lanetzach v'hanora b'norotecha, hamelech hayoshev al kisei ram v'nisa. This concludes Pesukei de Zimra, the preliminary service. I'll continue with Shacharit, which begins on the 6th line of 147. Shochen ad marom v'kadosh shemo v'chatuv rananu tzadikim b'Adonai l'shem na'amatela. B'fi yesharim tithalal uvdivrei tzadikim titbarach uv'yoshon chasidim titromam uvkerev kedoshim titkadash uv'makalot rivavot Amecha Beit Yisrael, Barina Yitparshim Chamalkenim Bechol Dor Vador. Shekain Chovat Kol HaYitzurim Lefanecha, Adonai Eloheinu V'Elokei Avoteinu, Laudot Lehalel Leshabeach Lefaer Leromem Lehader Levarech Le'ala Ulkales על כל דברי שירות ותשבחות, David ben Yishai avdecha meshichecha. We rise 148. Yishtabach shimcha la'ad malkeinu ha'el ha'melech ha'gadol v'ha'kadosh v'ha'shamayim v'ha'aretz ki lecha ne'melech shirish v'chalev v'zimrat v'n'ram Berachot v'hodaot me'ata v'ad olam baruch ata Adonai El melech gadol batishbachot El hahodaot Adon haniflaot habocher b'shirei zimra Melech el chei olamim. You can be seated. We continue at the top of page 150. Baruch ata Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam Yotzer or uvorei choshech, choseh shalom uvorei et hakol. Hakol yoducha, v'hakol yeshabechucha, v'hakol yomru ein kadosh k'Adonai. Hakol yiromu muchasel yoter kolel, apotech kol yom telatot shavrim hizrach uvagel. Ein kerkecha v'yein zulatecha efes biyotecha umido melach. Ein kerkecha Adonai Eloheinu ba'olam hazeh ve'ein zulatcha malkeinu lechayei ha'olam haba efes biyotecha go'aleinu limot hamashiach ve'ein do melech hamoshienu litchiyat hametim. El Adon al kol hamasim baruch umvorach befikon neshama godlo vetuvo malei olam da'at utvuna sovevim oto hamit ga'el chayot hakodesh v'nedar bechavod al merkava zachut umishor lifnei chiso Chesed verachamim lifnei chevodo Tovim me'orot shebara Eloheinu Yetzara beda'at bevina uvhaskel koach ugvura Natan bahem lion moshlim bekerev tevel Maleim zivum fikim noga na'azivam bechol ha'olam Samechim b'tzeitam v'sasim bevoam Osim b'yem maratzon konam Pe'er v'chavod notnim lishmot Zohol averina lezecher malchuto Kara l'shemesh v'yizrach ora'a V'hitkin surata levana Shavach notnim lo Kol teva maram tiferet gedula Seraphim ve'ofanim ve'chayot hakodesh Le'el asher shavat mikol ha'ma'asim Bayom hashvi'i tiferet liyom hamnucha Onei kara liyom ha'shabbat shavak shalim Titbarach Moshienu Shevach Ma'aseh Yadecha Ve'al Me'orei Or Shasita Yefaru Chaseh top of 153. Titbarach Tureinu Malkeinu V'go Aleinu Borei Kedoshim Yishabashim Chaliyah Malkeinu Yotzim Hashem B'Shem Kulam Ahovim, Kulam Berurim, Kulam Giborim Vechulam osim beim al vira reton konam Vechulam potachim et bihem bikdusha uv'tohora Beshira uv'zimra Umbarchim umshabachim umfarim Umaritzim umakdishim umamlichim Et Shem ha'el ha'melech ha'gadol Ha'gibor v'hanora kadoshu Vechulam mekabelim alehem O machut shamayim zeh v'notenim reshut zeh lazeh Lagdish leotaram benachat rach Besafa v'ravinim ha'kedosha Kulam kechad Oni v'yomerim be'ira Kadosh, 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 Adonai Tzevaot, Melech kol haaretz kevodo. והאופנים וחיות הקודש ברעש גדול מתנשאים לעומת שרפים, לעומת המשבחים ואומרים ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו לאל ברוך נעימות ייתנו למלך החי וקיים זמירות יאמרו ותשבחות ישמיעו כי הוא לבדו פלג ונושא שבאמת. אור חדש על ציון תאיר ונזכה כולנו מהרה לאורו ברוך אתה אדוני יוצר המאורות. 154 Ava Rabba Avtanu Adonai Eloheinu. Vavienu leshalom merba kanfot haaretz vetolichenu kama miyot le'artzeinu ki el poel yeshuot ata uvanu v'charta mikolam velashon vekeravtanu לשמך הגדול סלע באמת, להודות לך ולייחדך באהבה, ברוך אתה אדוני, הבוחר בעמו ישראל באהבה, אל מלך נאמן. שמע ישראל Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, Baruch Shem Kevod Malchuto Le'olam V'Olam. Ve'ahavta et Adonai Elohecha bechol levavcha v'chol nafshecha uv'chol meodecha ve'hayu hadevarim ha'ele Asher anochi metavecha hayom al levavecha veshinantam levanecha vezibarta bam beshivtecha b'veitecha uvlechtecha avaderech uvshochbecha uvkumecha ukshartam leot al yadecha vehayu letotafot beineinecha uchtaftam al mezuzot beitecha Uvi sharecha vehaya im shama tishma mitzvah asher anochi mitzavecha mayom. Esmer limim dacham yachadam v'zeh hishamar lechem b'nivtei levavchem v'sartem v'atem v'nechor v'nei b'cham v'yatzar tashmayim v'yematar v'ha'adama lo titen etibud lam v'temer me'al aretz v'asher nitem v'samtem v'devar ele al v'avchem v'al nafshem ukshartem otam le'yatlam v'yitzvot b'neinechem v'limaratem otam v'bnechem l'daber b'am b'shivt v'yavnechem v'avchem v'nei ukshavchem uktavchem v'zal b'techa v'yishor laman Yomer Adonai Moshe Lemor Daber Al V'Yasulam Tzitzit Al Kanvei V'Dehem L'Derotam V'Nanu Tzitzit Hakanal Tiltachen V'Yalachem L'Tzitzit Or Ita Moto Uzkartam V'Kol Mitzvot V'Narvasitam Otam V'Lotatu Or Achar L'Chem V'Yachanechem Asher Tam Slim Acharhem Lema'an Tizguru V'Astem V'Kolot V'Yidhem Rashim Lachem Asher Tzedechem Eretz Mitzrayim L'Yalachem L'Elohim Ani Adonai L'Elohim אני אדוני אלוהיכם אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים אני אדוני אלוהיכם אמת ויציב ונכון וקיים וישר ונאמן ואמן לדור ודור קיים ושמו קיים וכיסו נכון ומלכותו ואמונתו לעד קיימת ודבריו חיים וקיימים נאמנים ונכונים לעד ולמי עולמים על אבותינו ועלינו אמנם אמת שאתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו מלכנו מלך אבותינו גואלנו גואל אבותינו יוצרנו צור ישועתנו פודנו מצילנו מעולם שמך אין אלוהים זולתך עזרת אבותינו אתה הוא מעולם מגן משה ונאמר תהילות לאל עליון ברוך ומבורך משה ומרים ובני ישראל לך אנו שירה בשמחה רבה ויאמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורא תהילות אוסף לשירה חדשה שיבחו גאולים לשמך שפתיים יחד כולם הטובים לכו ויאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד הנאי נאי 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 צור ישראל קומה בעזרת ישראל ובטחנו ממך יהודה וישראל גואלנו אדוני צבאות שמו קדוש ישראל ברוך אתה אדוני גאל Israel. We'll begin with the first two brachot of the Amidah out loud together. After that, I'll invite you to skip the Kedusha and continue silently on your own. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu v'Elohei Avoteinu Elohei Avraham Elohei Yitzchak v'Elohei Yaakov Elohei Sarah Elohei Rivka Elohei Rachel v'Elohei Leah Ha'el Hagadol Hagibor v'Hanora El Elyon Gomel Chasadim Tovim v'Konei Hakol וזוכר חסדי אבות ומביא גואל לבני בניהם למען שמו באהבה מלך עוזר ופוקד ומושיע ומגן ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם ופוקד שרה אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני מחיי מתים אתה רב להושיע משיב הרוח ומוריד הגשם, מחלקל חיים בחסד, מחיי מתים ברחמים רבים, סומך נופלים ברופא חולים, ומתיר אסורים, ומקיים אמונתו לשני עפר. מי כמוך בעל גבורות ומיתו מלך מלך ממית ומחיה ומצמיח ישועה ונאמן אתה להחיות מתים ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים אתה קדוש שמך קדוש קדושים בו ימי ברוך אתה אדוני האל הקדוש ישמח משה במנתך כל כי אבן אמרנו Oh, say shalom, shalom, limromav. Oh, yaseh shalom. Oh, say shalom, shalom, bimromav. Oh, yaseh shalom. Oh, yaseh shalom. Shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'imeru amen. I'll invite you to turn in your Chumashim to page 404 in your Chumashim. We are reading this week from Parshat Beshalach. As I said before, Parshat Beshalach has the Song of the Sea, this really important, paramount moment in our people's biblical history, where they cross through on dry land and they sing out in song and praise to God. So I'm going to lane a little bit more of the Parsha than I usually do, so we can have some of the lead up, which I'll read. I'll chant in Hebrew and then the English, and then we'll chant the Az Yashir in the special melody. When I get to that point, typically in shul we rise for listening to Az Yashir, and so I want to invite you, even in your own space at home, if you're able to, if you're comfortable, to please rise. When we get to that point, I'll indicate to y'all. If you are in a different chumash, we are in Exodus chapter 14, verse 21. Chapter 14, verse 21, and in our chumashim, it's on page 404. Verse 21. Vayet Moshe et yado al hayam, vayolech Adonai et hayam, beruach kadim azak kol halayla, vayasem et hayam lacharava, vayibaku hamayim, vayavo v'nei Yisrael b'toch hayam vayabasha, v'hamayim lahem choma miminam umismolam. Vayirdefu mitzrayim vayvo acharihem kol su'us paro richpo ufarashav el toch hayam. Vayhi bashmoret haboker vayashkef Adonai al machane mitzrayim ba'amud eish va'anan vayam et מחנה מצרים. ויסר את אופן מרכבותיו, וינהגהו בכבדות. ויאמר מצרים, אנוסה מפני ישראל, כי אדוני נלחם להם במצרים. ויאמר אדוני אל משה, נטה את ידך על הים, וישובו המים על מצרים, על רכבו ועל פרשיו. ויית משה את ידו על הים, וישוב הים לפנות בוקר לאיתנו, ומצרים נסים לקראתו. וינער אדוני את מצרים בתוך הים. וישובו המים, ויכסו את הרכב ואת הפרשים, לכוך אל פרעה הבאים אחריהם בים. לא נשאר בהם עד אחד. ובני ישראל הלכו ביבשה בתוך הים, והמים להם חומה מימינם ומשמאלם. ויושע אדוני ביום ההוא את ישראל מיד מצרים, וירא ישראל את מצרים מת על שפת הים. וירא ישראל את היד הגדולה אשר עשה אדוני במצרים, ויראו העם את אדוני, ויאמינו באדוני ובמשה עבדו. אז ישיר משה ובני ישראל את השירה הזאת לאדוני, ויאמרו לאמור, אשיר לאדוני כי גאו גאה, סוס ורוכבו, רמה וים, עוזי וזמרתיה. ויהי לי לישועה, זה לוויין והוא, אלוהי אביו ארוממנו, אדוני איש מלחמה, אדוני שמו. מרכבות פרעה וחילו ירה בים, ומבחר של אישיו טובעו בים סוף, תהומות יחס יומול, ירדו במטלות כמו אבן. ימינך אדוני נדרי בכוח, ימינך אדוני תירץ אויב, וברוב גנך תרוס קמך, תשלח ארונך יאכלמו כקש, וברוח אפיך נערמו מים, נאספו כמו נוזלים, קפאו תמות בלב ים. אמר אויב ארדוף אשיג, אחלק שלל, תמלאמו נפשי אריך חרבי, תורישמו ידי. נפשת ברוחך כי שמו ים, צללו כעופרת במים אדירים. מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות עושה פלא. נטית ימינך תבלעם הארץ, נחית בחסדך עמזו גאלת, נהלת בעוזך אל נווה קודשך. שמעו עמים גיר גזון, חיל אחז יושבי פלשת. אז נבהלו אלופי אדום, אלי מואב יאחזמו רעד, נעמוגו כל יושבי כנען. תיפול אליהם אימתה ופחד, בגדול זרעך ידמו כאבן. עד יעבור עמך אדוני, עד יעבור עמזו קניתה. תביאמו ותיטעמו בהר, נחתך מכון לשבטך, פעלת אדוני מקדש אדוני כוננו ידך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד. I'm going to stop there in the laning, and I'll read the beginning from, well, not from the beginning, from verse 26 on the top of page 405. Then Adonai said to Moshe, hold out your arms over the sea, that the waters may come back upon the Egyptians and upon their chariots and upon their horsemen. Moses held out his arms over the sea, and at daybreak the sea returned to its normal state, and the Egyptians fled at its approach. But the Lord hurled the Egyptians into the sea. The waters turned back and covered the chariots and the horsemen. Pharaoh's entire army that followed them into the sea, not one of them remained. But the Israelites had marched through the sea on dry ground, the waters forming a wall for them on their right and on their left. Thus the Lord delivered Israel that day from the Egyptians. Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the shores of the sea, and when Israel saw the wondrous power which the Lord had wielded against the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai. They had faith in Adonai and in God's servant Moshe. And then they sang this song. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to Adonai. They sang, I will sing to Adonai, for God has triumphed gloriously. Horse and driver God has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might. Ozi v'zimratia vayihili lishua. God is my deliverance. This is my God, and I will enshrine God. It's a beautiful song. It's one of the oldest pieces of Torah literature, one of the earliest pieces of song that our people ever sang, that we continue to sing, that we sing as we did this morning as a part of our davening every day as Yashir is in our morning service. This is a beautiful part of what we read in Parshat Beshalach. And I actually want to speak a little bit on what happens before this, what happens at the very beginning of the Parsha that I didn't read this morning. Because the Parsha starts off with liberation, with the people being freed from slavery, leaving Mitzrayim and taking whatever they could out. But one particular thing that we're told about is that Moshe brings with him the bones of Joseph. The Torah says this week, "V'chamushim alu v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, v'yikach Moshe et atzmot Yosef imo, ki hashbeya hishbia et b'nei Yisrael lemor, pakod yivkod Elohim etchem v'alitem et atzmotai mizeitchem." Now the Israelites went up armed out of the land of Egypt, and Moshe took the bones of Joseph with him. For Joseph had them swear, saying, God will surely redeem you, and then you should carry my bones up from here with you. In many ways, we could see this as just the fulfilling of a promise. It's true, this was the last thing that Joseph said before he died. At the very end of the last book of the Torah, we read the book of Genesis of Breshit. He said, take my bones with you. And he did. Moshe never knew Yosef, of course. It had been many years. But he certainly knew about his legacy. He knew about the ways that Yosef had impacted the people, the people he was saving, and his land, the land of Egypt. And Moshe was certainly carrying out Yosef's legacy in bringing out his bones with him when he left Mitzrayim. But one of the questions that I have is why Moshe was the one to carry this out. Were there not more important things for Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our leader, to do in that moment when he's leading the people out of slavery? He stops and takes the bones of Joseph. Rashi, in a commentary much later actually on the book of Proverbs, says that this is a testament to Moshe's character. He writes, our teacher Moshe, while the rest of Israel was busy looting Egypt, Moshe was tending to sacred obligations, as it says, and Moshe took the bones of Joseph. Rashi here is saying something about Moshe's character, that it was special for Moshe, that Moshe was involved in sacred things, in holy things. So it was Moshe that took out the bones of Joseph. It was a righteous thing for him to do. But then the question for me is, what was it about Joseph and Joseph's bones that were so sacred and holy that it was Moshe's responsibility as the one who tends to sacred things to take out Joseph's bones? Were there not more important things for him to do in that exact moment of liberation? A beautiful midrash gives us a little bit of a clue with an interesting narrative of what actually happened later on, once the Israelites are out and they are wandering through the desert. I'll read it in the Hebrew and translate as I go. Kol otan 40 shana shahayu Yisrael mehalchim bamidbar. For all the 40 years that the Israelites were walking in the wilderness, haya aron hashchina, va'arono shel Yosef mehalchim ze b'tzad ze. The whole time that they're walking, there was the ark of God's presence, and there was the ark of Joseph that went with them side by side. V'hayu ha'ovrim v'hashavin omrin mativan shel shnei haronot halalu. And anyone who passed by them would ask, what's the nature, what's the purpose of these two different arks? Amru lahen, echad shel shechina ve'echad shel met. One is of God's presence, and one is of the deceased, the one that holds Joseph's bones. And they would ask, V'chi efshar lamet lahalech im hashchina? Really? It's possible for a dead person's body to go alongside God's presence? Are those not incompatible things? We wouldn't want the impurity of a dead body next to the ark that holds God's presence. And they responded to them, Kiyem zeh ma shebetoch zeh. This one, the dead one, the one with Joseph, fulfilled all that is written in this one, in the one of God's presence, the one that held the tablets. I want to unpack what this midrash is saying, and perhaps what it teaches us about Joseph, what it teaches us about Moshe bringing Joseph's bones out of the land of Mitzrayim. This midrash is saying that the entire time that the Israelites are wandering, there were two arks that they carried. One, of course, had the tablets, those tablets that Moshe hasn't received yet, but he will next week when we read Parshat Yitro at Mount Sinai. One ark holds those tablets. And one ark is holding the bones of Joseph. Now we have to remember, Moshe brings the bones out of Mitzrayim because Joseph is theoretically going to be buried in the land of Israel, but it's 40 years until they get there. So here we have this beautiful line at the beginning of this week's parsha that Moshe brings the bones out, but they've got to do something with them for the whole time, those 40 years they're wandering. And here it tells us they held them in a special ark alongside the ark that held the luchot, the tablets. And people are going to ask, right? People are going to wonder, isn't that strange? But the reason is that the ark holding Joseph's bones is in many ways the embodiment of the other ark, the ark that holds the luchot, the ark that holds the commandments of God written by God's finger. There is the word of God, and there is the actual embodiment of those words of God, of the mitzvot. There is an idea for us to understand a person that lived by those words. The example that Joseph set for them must be just as important as the words of God themselves. That's why it was so important and so holy for Moshe to be the one to bring Joseph's bones out of Mitzrayim. The Midrash continues, I'm not going to go into this part, of bringing in the 10 Commandments, what's written on the luchot in that other ark, and describing for each one ways that Joseph lived out that particular commandment to really bring to life the fact that the Midrash is saying that Yosef embodied those commandments. And so the Midrash is telling us that these aren't just bones, and that Joseph isn't just a dead body. His bones and the life that he lived are as sacred as those tablets. They're as sacred as the Word of God. In this moment when the people are coming out of Egypt, yes, they fulfill that promise made to Joseph, but it also means something bigger. It's something that they're supposed to learn from that moment. They also didn't know Joseph. And there are a few educational moments for me in this moment. One comes from my teacher, Rabbi David Kasher, who wrote that the second ark is a reminder that death is as much a part of the story as is life. The purpose of the Exodus is to release the forces of life, the liberation that will allow former slaves to live fully in the world as free people. But this freedom has not been achieved without death along the way. The death of their ancestors, the death of the slaves who never made it out, the death of the children drowned in the Nile, the death of the firstborn. And so while we celebrate life, we honor death, and we never forget those that have come before us. They are just as much a part of our story as we are. For these Israelites, it was important that they remember that death was a part of their story, even as they're embarking on a very new journey. And that leads to the second piece of learning. Moshe was leading the people by reminding them that their future encompasses the past. I could imagine a reality where these individuals coming from slavery and going towards liberation would want to forget everything about their past. I wouldn't blame them for wanting to put the entire thing behind them. The past was hard, and in many ways, Joseph brings up the hard stuff of their past. He was the one that saved their ancestors from famine and the one that brought them to Mitzrayim in the first place. And it was Joseph who was forgotten by the new king of Mitzrayim that led to their enslavement. Remembering Joseph and keeping him alongside them throughout their entire time in the wilderness can bring up hard stuff. But in the moment when they're finally free, walking on dry land out of Egypt, they are told they still have to remember. They always have to remember Mitzrayim. Many years later, we'll read in the book of Joshua, once the Israelites are finally in the land of Israel, that Joseph's bones are actually buried. Ve'et atzmot Yosef asher ha'elu b'nei Yisrael miMitzrayim kavru b'Shechem bechelkat hasadeh asher kana Yaakov. The bones of Joseph, which the Israelites brought up from Mitzrayim, were buried at Shechem in the piece of ground that Jacob had purchased. This verse in Joshua says that the bones of Joseph, which the Israelites brought up from Mitzrayim. There's no mention of Moshe here, right? Earlier we read that the Israelites were all busy looting Mitzrayim, and Moshe was the one who took on the sacred obligation of getting Joseph's bones. But here, there's no Moshe. It's as if Moshe didn't bring them up. We know Moshe didn't make it to Israel. So the Israelites took on that task that he had started. There's something beautiful about this, even in the sadness of Moshe not being able to make it to Israel. Because what it means is that the Israelites understood those lessons. They took them upon themselves and they internalized them. They knew it was important to hold on to the past. They knew they had to confront death as a part of life. Even in their moment of liberation and freedom, and now in the book of Joshua, their moment of living in the land, finally, they know that they have to still remember the past and the hard times and death. But what we learn here, finally, is that it wasn't just Moshe carrying on that message. It was all of them, collectively. As a collective effort, they knew that this was who they were as a people. They took on the task for Moshe. They internalized it. And they carried Joseph's bones with them. And hopefully, we do too. Ken Yehi Ratzon. Ki mitzion tetzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim. 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 I want to include a Misha Berach for Cholim today, as we always do. I'll read the list of names following a brief silence here for you to include the names of those that you are davening for. Afterwards, we're going to sing the Misha Berach song written by Debbie Friedman, Aleha Shalom. This past week was Debbie Friedman's 10th yahrzeit, and in some ways it feels quite fitting that I want to think about her today, that her yahrzeit was the week of Shabbat Shirah, because Debbie Friedman in so many ways embodied what song was. She taught so many people how to pray, how to sing, to open up their souls through song. And so I want to honor her this morning with that singing. Misha berach avotenu Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov ve'imotenu Sarah Rivka Rachel v'Leah hu yivarech v'yirapeh hacholim. Vat Hayden Adam, Sandy Armis, Dafkan Ashkenazi, Ami Ashkenazi, Tala Ashkenazi, Eileen Carol Battleman, Helen Beavers, Ricky Beavers, David Bennett, Janice Berlin, Brody Brayman, Sandra Bresnick, Jane Brown, Beverly Cassius, Sandy Catania, Ann Coggin, Isabel Cohen, Jill Cohen, Nathan Dion, Howard Fetter, Carolyn Foley, Tom Gadberry, Lynn Gomberg, Mimi Grossman, Joe Hetzel, Harold Herlick, Marvin Jacobson, Austin Cabot, Marilyn Lieber, Aaron Linkove, Michelle Mann, Mark Mathias, Cameron Miller, Gary Murray, Alan Nadell, Marsha Nodowich, Tom O'Hara, Santa Panton, Phillips Pratt, Glenn Rainbow, Emily Schauman, Kevin Shiner, Darlene Shefsky, Lisa Shipowitz, Bud Skarupa, Jean Stites, Susan Stein, Pat Stevens, Tom Stevens, Rachel Siegel-Strauss, Edna Wiener, Rita Witt, Rodney Wolf, Debbie Yanks, Aaron Ben Yosef Abracha, Chanya Rivka, Bat Chana, Chavet Zero, Bat Esther, Elko Bat Nachama, Sarah Esther, Bat Rachel, Chana Leah Bat Shoshana Leah, Malka Simcha Tova, Bat Gittel, Moshe Ben Rachel, Ovadia, Ben Sar, Rachaman, Ben Sora, Rachel Sarah, Bat Leah, Yaakov David, Ben Devorah, Yehuda Zelka, Bat Rachel, Yisrael Eliyahu, Ben Leah, HaKadosh, Baruch Hu Yimale Rachamim Alehem, L'Achzikamu Rabotam, V'yishlach Lehem, Mehera, Refuah Shlema, Min HaShamayim, Refuat HaNefesh, Refuat HaGuf, B'toch Shar HaCholim, V'chazek et Yidei Haoskim B'tzorcheihem, Shabbat Milizok, Urfra Karova Lavo, Hashta Bagala Vizman Kariv, V'nomar Amen. Mishabeirach Avotenu, Mekor HaBracha, Leimotenu. May the source of strength, who bless the ones before us, help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say Amen. Mishabeirach imotenu, Mekor HaBracha, Lavotenu. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say Amen. We'll make our way towards the end of the service. I'll invite you to join me on page 204 in our Sidurim for Ein Keloheinu, page 204. Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kemalkeinu, Ein Kemoshienu, Micheloheinu, Michadonenu, Michemalkeinu, Michemoshienu. Nodel Eloheinu, Nodel Adonenu, Nodel Malkeinu, Nodel Moshienu. Baruch Eloheinu, Baruch Adonenu, Baruch Malkeinu, Baruch Moshienu. Atahu Eloheinu, Atahu Adonenu, Atahu Malkeinu, Atahu Moshienu, Atahu Shehiktiru Avotenu lefanecha ketorat hasamim. Yanai na 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 na, yanai yanai, yanai na 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 na, yanai na na na, yanai na 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 na, yanai yanai, yanai na 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 na, yanai na na na. Page 205. Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, latet gedula leotzer breshit, shelo asanu kigoye ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishpachot adama, shelo sam chalkeinu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, v'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא, שהוא נוטה שמיים ויוסד הארץ, ומושב יקרה בשמיים ממעל, ושכינתו זו מגובי מרומים. הוא אלוהינו אין עוד, אמת מלכנו אפס ולטום, ככתוב בתורתו, וידעת היום והשבות אל לבביך, כי אדוני הוא האלוהים בשמיים ממעל, ועל הארץ מתחת אין עוד. על כן נקווה לך אדוני אלוהינו ליבו מהרה בתפארת עוזך להעביר גילו לימינן. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו echad. You can be seated. In the coming week, we honor the yahrzeits of the following: Seymour Hellman, Jack Hoffman, Joe Bloomfield, Charlotte Borodkin, Jack Cantor, Nathan Berlin, Laverne Struminger, Robert Bernstein, Elaine Alexander, Toby Yellen, Mo Cassius, Steve Lipson, Dave Feldman, David Engelman, Dennis Beavers, and Fanny Padower. I'll invite all those who are in mourning or observing a yahrzeit to join me in our modified Mourner's Kaddish. We skip the middle Yehei Shmei line reserved for when we have a minyan, but we'll recite the rest together, page 207. Yit Gadal, Vayit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah, Be'alma, Divra, Kirute, Ve'amlech Malchute, B'chayechon, Uv'yomechon, Uv'chayei, Zechol Beit Yisrael, Ba'agala, Uvizman, Kariv, V'imru, Amen, Yit Barach, V'yishtabach, V'yit Pa'ar, V'yit Romam, V'yit Naseh, V'yit Hadar, V'yit Aleh, V'yit Halal, Shemei Dekudsha, Brichu, Le'ela, Min Kol Birchata, V'shirata, Tush Bechata, V'nechamata, Da'amiran, Be'alma, V'imru, Amen, Yehei Shlama, Rabba, Min Shemaya, V'chayim Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen, Oseh Shalom B'imramav, Hu Ya'aseh Shalom Aleinu, Ve'al Kol Yisrael, V'imru, Amen. Shabbat Shalom to all of you. Thank you for joining us this morning in our davening. We have a bunch of birthdays. It's fun to read this list. Happy birthday today to Celia Shafson, who turns 9 today. Happy birthday to Abby O'Gwyn, Mindy Lipson, Rachel Cohen, Sylvia Feldbaum, Fred Levko, Yaniv Rich turns 3 this week, Sydney Shankers 15, Sharon O'Gwyn, Leah Alprin, Charlie Belenke, Marlene Gerson, Kim Giles, and Sky Roberts. Mazal Tov to all of you. Any announcements for this week? No announcements for this week. We'll conclude this morning with Adon Olam. Lavi said he has an announcement. I'm not sure what it is. We have Adon Olam on page 211. You want to join me? Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yetzir Nivra Le'et Nasa B'chefzo Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra Azai melech shemo nikra ve'acharei kichlot hakol levado yimloch nora vehu haya vehu hovem vehu yiyeh betifara vehu yiyeh betifara vehu echad ve'yen sheni laham shilo lehachbira beli reishim beli tachlit velo ha'oz ve'hamisra velo ha'oz ve'hamisra vehu eli v'chai go'ali v'tzor chavli b'yetzara vehu nisi umanos li menat kosi beyom ekra menat kosi beyom ekra beyado afkin ruchi be'et ishan ve'a'ira ve'im ruchi geviatim Adonai li velo ira Adonai li velo ira. Shabbat Shalom. You say Shabbat Shalom? Emo was davening. Who's in the back of the shul? Who is that? Who is it? Gio. Shabbat Shalom. G-I-E-I-O. That's right.
Yeah, it's funny. Right?
That's Lovey's newest joke.
Come here, Beth.
G-I-E-I-O.
Can we let Ima take off her talit and microphone?
Shabbat Shalom.